The sterile hum of the air conditioning unit was usually a soothing backdrop to my meticulous work, a quiet symphony that allowed me to focus, to parse through data, to orchestrate complex projects with the precision of a master conductor. My name is Marissa Thorne, and for 40 years I have lived by a simple, unwavering code: precision, integrity, and the sanctity of a written agreement. Atlanta, Georgia, with its sprawling corporate campuses and fierce competition, was the perfect crucible for someone like me. I thrived on clarity, on the certainty that comes from every I being dotted and every T crossed. Ambiguity, verbal promises, the casual dismissal of a signed contract. These were the antithesis of everything I held dear, the very things I had spent my entire career fighting against, having seen firsthand the catastrophic fallout they could unleash. My current challenge, a colossal digital transformation project for a major aerospace client, was poised to be the crowning achievement of my career at Sterling Innovations. We were tasked with overhauling their legacy systems, a multi-million-dollar undertaking that promised efficiency, security, and a significant boost to their global competitiveness. The stakes were astronomical, not just for Sterling Innovations, but for the client and indeed for my own professional standing. My reputation, built brick by painstaking brick over 2 decades, rested on the success of this endeavor. I had poured countless hours into vetting potential vendors, poring over their proposals, demanding ironclad guarantees because corporate reputation, in my view, was a fragile, precious thing, easily shattered by a single misstep. That's when Julian Vance entered the picture. He strode into our initial vendor selection meeting like a modern-day titan, radiating an almost intoxicating blend of confidence and charm. His company, Vance Solutions, was relatively new to the scene, but their presentation was slick, their promises grand, and Julian himself was a master orator, weaving tales of innovation and seamless execution. He spoke of cutting-edge technology and unheard-of efficiencies, all delivered with a disarming smile and a casual flick of his wrist. I observed him with a discerning eye, my internal alarm bells quietly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to chime. Something about his easy dismissals of detailed protocols, his preference for gentlemen's agreements over exhaustive contractual language, struck a dissonant chord within me. My gut, honed by years of navigating treacherous corporate waters, whispered a warning. My concerns, however, were ultimately outweighed by the enthusiasm of our senior executives, who were captivated by Julian's charismatic pitch and Vance Solutions' impossibly low bid. They saw a disruptive innovator, I saw a potential liability cloaked in glitz. Despite my repeated insistence on rigorous contract negotiations, Julian always seemed to skirt the edges of true commitment. He'd nod, smile, and say, "Of course, Marissa, we're all on the same page, aren't we?" Trust is the foundation of any great partnership. He'd make grand verbal assurances, then somehow those specifics would be omitted or diluted in the final drafts, often replaced with vague, open-ended clauses that gave his company an alarming amount of wiggle room. I fought tooth and nail for every comma, every semicolon, every specific deliverable and penalty clause, yet the pressure to sign to get the project moving was immense. In the end, I managed to secure a contract that, while not perfect, I believed offered at least some protection. It was a compromise, a bitter pill for a woman who lived by absolutes, but I had done my best within the confines of a senior management directive that favored speed and perceived cost savings over my cautious insistence on meticulous detail. The project kicked off with an almost celebratory air, a false dawn that masked the storm brewing beneath. Julian was still the charmer, but his promises quickly began to unravel. Deadlines were missed not by a little but by weeks. Key functionalities were delivered incomplete or riddled with bugs. When my team, my meticulous, dedicated team, raised these issues, Julian's responses were a masterclass in deflection. "Oh, that was a misunderstanding, Marissa," he'd purr, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "We discussed that, remember, verbally. You agreed we'd prioritize the core module first." He had a remarkable ability to rewrite history, to insist that nebulous, unrecorded conversations had somehow superseded the clear, if imperfect, terms of our signed agreement. My blood pressure would spike. Every time he uttered the phrase verbal agreement, a cold, hard knot would form in my stomach. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that we were heading for disaster. The ultimate betrayal arrived not with a bang, but with a whimper followed by a seismic shockwave. Vance Solutions, after months of delivering substandard work and consistently falling behind schedule, abruptly declared they had exhausted their budget for the project. Julian, with a straight face, claimed that the scope had drastically expanded due to our alleged verbal requests, demands for features that were never in the contract, never approved in writing, never even seriously discussed in any formal meeting. He presented an invoice for an additional $7 million, a figure so ludicrous it initially stunned me into silence. $7 million for work that was largely incomplete, riddled with errors, and certainly not what we had contractually agreed upon. The client, understandably, was furious. They had already invested heavily, their operations were now disrupted, and the promised transformation was nowhere in sight. Their executive team, usually calm and composed, became a whirlwind of accusations and threats. Sterling Innovations, my company, found itself caught between a rock and a hard place. We had vouched for Vance Solutions, albeit with my fervent internal reservations. Our corporate reputation, that fragile, precious thing I sought to protect, was now being dragged through the mud. The CEO, Mr. Henderson, a man known for his calm demeanor, called me into his office, his face a mask of grim disappointment. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. His quiet "Marissa, what happened?" was far more devastating than any shouting. He gestured to a pile of documents, all of them indicating Vance Solutions' failures, but none providing an unequivocal, legally binding counterargument to Julian's fabricated claims of verbal agreements. That meeting was a turning point. It wasn't just about a project failing anymore. It was about a fundamental violation of trust, a desecration of the principles I held sacred. Julian Vance hadn't just swindled my company out of millions, he had attacked the very foundation of ethical business conduct. He had leveraged ambiguity, the very thing I despised, as a weapon. The rage that simmered within me was cold, precise, and entirely focused. It wasn't a fleeting emotion. It was a deeply rooted conviction that justice, in this specific, infuriating case, needed to be served. I realized with chilling clarity that the chaotic fallout Julian had caused would not be allowed to stand. He needed to learn that some people, like me, remembered every detail, every slight, every unkept promise. And for those interested in seeing such detailed retribution unfold, I'd suggest you subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. My story, I decided then and there, was only just beginning. The aftermath of Julian Vance's spectacular corporate sabotage plunged Sterling Innovations into a maelstrom of legal battles and frantic damage control. The aerospace client, bleeding money and facing significant operational delays, had initiated arbitration proceedings, demanding compensation for the incomplete work and the immense disruption. My meticulous records, the countless emails, meeting minutes, and change order requests I had tirelessly documented, became our primary defense. Yet Julian, with his infuriatingly smooth demeanor, countered every piece of written evidence with a shrug and a disingenuous claim of miscommunication or verbal understanding. He produced his own fabricated meeting notes, conveniently vague and impossible to disprove. It was a sickening game of he said, she said, but with millions of dollars at stake and the reputation of Sterling Innovations hanging by a thread. My days transformed into an exhausting blur of emergency meetings, calls with high-priced corporate lawyers, and attempts to salvage what little functionality Vance Solutions had managed to deliver. The strain was immense. I was working 18-hour days, fueled by stale coffee and an unshakable sense of indignation. My colleagues, while supportive, couldn't hide the worry in their eyes. The whispers started circulating. Was Marissa Thorne too trusting? Did she miss something in the contract? The implication was subtle, but it was there, a corrosive acid eating away at my professional standing. My once unblemished reputation, a source of quiet pride, felt tarnished, smeared by Julian Vance's audacious dishonesty. This wasn't just about work anymore, it was deeply personal. My principles, my entire professional ethos had been attacked. I spent countless sleepless nights replaying every interaction with Julian, every casual remark, every unwritten promise he'd made. My meticulous nature, which had always been my strength, now felt like a curse, forcing me to dissect every single detail, searching for the crack in his facade, the undeniable proof of his deceit. I started researching Vance Solutions, digging deeper than the glossy brochures and superficial press releases. I scoured industry forums, financial reports, and even local business registries. What I found was a pattern, a disturbing mosaic of similar stories from other companies, albeit on a smaller scale, where Vance Solutions had promised much, delivered little, and then used verbal agreements as an excuse to demand more money or simply abandon projects. It was his signature move, a carefully refined scam. This wasn't just a corporate dispute, it was a deliberate, predatory tactic. Julian Vance wasn't just incompetent, he was a con artist, preying on the trust of his clients and exploiting the gray areas of corporate agreements. The realization solidified my resolve. Fixing the immediate problem was one thing, but allowing Julian Vance to continue his predatory practices, to leave a trail of broken promises and ruined reputations in his wake, was entirely another. My struggle shifted from merely defending Sterling Innovations to actively seeking justice for what he had done, not just to us, but to potentially many others. This transformation was chillingly precise. My meticulousness was no longer just about project management, but about constructing an irrefutable case against Julian. I began building my own dossier, not for our legal team, but for a reckoning I intended to orchestrate myself. One particularly grueling week, after a devastating arbitration session where Julian, unbelievably, managed to spin a web of lies so convincing that even our own lawyers looked momentarily rattled, I walked out of the conference room feeling utterly drained, a profound despair settling over me. Had I truly been so naive? Had my unwavering belief in the power of clear agreements blinded me to the existence of such brazen dishonesty? I questioned everything. My integrity felt compromised, my judgment clouded. I even considered resigning, escaping the suffocating pressure and the constant feeling of being outmaneuvered. But then I saw a reflection of myself in the polished glass of the office building, a woman tired but unbroken, her eyes still burning with a quiet fire. Surrendering was not an option. It never had been. It was during this period of intense introspection and exhaustive research that I stumbled upon a crucial detail. Julian Vance, always so confident, had a weakness: his ego. He loved to boast, to take credit, to present himself as the unparalleled genius behind Vance Solutions. I remembered him casually mentioning an early, groundbreaking project when he claimed had put his company on the map. He'd gloated about the flexibility of the client, how they'd adapted to his innovative approach, allowing him to redefine the scope mid-project without any formal amendments. He even said something about how the client had been so impressed they didn't even care about the paperwork. This seemingly innocuous detail, recalled in a moment of bitter reflection, sparked a flicker of an idea. If he loved taking credit, perhaps he had documented his own misdeeds unwittingly in his personal efforts to self-aggrandize. My research intensified, focusing on those early projects. I cross-referenced industry news, old press releases, and even local business community forums where Julian might have boasted about his triumphs. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but my patience, a trait often mistaken for stubbornness, was boundless. I spent every evening long after leaving the office hunched over my laptop, meticulously piecing together a timeline of Vance Solutions' past engagements, looking for patterns, looking for the specific instances where Julian's verbal agreements had led to chaos and then, conveniently, to an escalated invoice or a quietly abandoned project. It was slow, painstaking work, often frustrating, but the thought of Julian Vance walking away unscathed, his pockets lined with ill-gotten gains, was enough to fuel my every waking moment. This single-minded focus was all-consuming, and honestly, if you're finding this level of detailed payback as captivating as I did, you really should subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. They understand the depths of true vengeance. One evening, deep into the digital archives of an obscure tech journal from 5 years prior, I found it. An interview with Julian Vance, a puff piece about his company's meteoric rise. In it, he specifically detailed the pivotal project he had mentioned, a software build for a regional logistics firm, Apex Freight. He described how he had convinced Apex to deviate from the original detailed contract, shifting resources based on fluid daily conversations and his gut instincts. The article even quoted him almost verbatim, saying, "Sometimes you just know what the client truly needs even if they haven't put it on paper. Trust me, the paper trail isn't always the best trail." He even implied that Apex Freight had to pay extra for these unplanned but essential features. This was it, not just a boast but an admission, a public acknowledgement of his modus operandi. He had, in his arrogant pride, openly described his fraud. It wasn't direct evidence for our current arbitration, but it was a blueprint of his criminal behavior. It was the crack I needed. My strategy began to coalesce. I couldn't use this old article directly in our current legal battle as it was tangential to the Sterling Innovations contract, but I could use it as leverage. I could use it to expose Julian Vance not just as an incompetent vendor but as a habitual deceiver. My meticulous nature had always been about preventing chaos. Now it was about creating it for one specific individual. The transformation was complete. The despair had faded, replaced by a cold, unwavering determination. Julian Vance had built his empire on quicksand. I would be the architect of its collapse. The struggle had refined me, sharpened my focus, and turned my principles into a weapon. The plan I devised was intricate, precise, and utterly ruthless. It wasn't about destroying Julian Vance's life, not in the petty sense of personal ruin. It was about dismantling his professional credibility, exposing his fraudulent business practices, and ensuring he could never again leverage his charm and ambiguity to victimize another company. My revenge would be corporate, swift, and entirely within the bounds of legal and ethical conduct, albeit with a devastatingly strategic execution. My first step was to discreetly reach out to a contact at Apex Freight, the logistics firm Julian had boasted about in that old article. I didn't mention Julian directly. Instead, I posed as a researcher for an industry white paper on best practices in vendor management, particularly focusing on how companies navigate scope creep and unforeseen project challenges. My questions were open-ended, designed to elicit their experiences without leading them. The project manager I spoke with, a tired-sounding woman named Sharon, recounted a nightmare scenario eerily similar to ours. Vance Solutions had taken their initial deposit, delivered half-finished work, and then demanded an additional 30% for out-of-scope work that had never been formally approved. Sharon bitterly explained how they had ultimately cut their losses, abandoned the project, and found another vendor. The experience had nearly cost her own job and had left Apex Freight millions behind schedule. This conversation, while confirming my suspicions, also provided me with a crucial piece of information. Sharon had kept meticulous records of her own, a habit born from her own prior bad experiences with unscrupulous vendors. She had a mountain of internal emails, change logs, and even personal notes from meetings where Julian had verbally promised things, then denied them later. More importantly, she had the original signed contract, with its clear, unambiguous terms that Vance Solutions had so flagrantly violated. Sharon was still seething with resentment over the incident, and when I cautiously, vaguely hinted that Julian Vance might be repeating his patterns, a spark of vengeful recognition lit up in her voice. My next move was to leverage my connections within the industry. As a veteran project manager, I had built a vast network over 2 decades, cultivating relationships with professionals who shared my commitment to ethical conduct and transparent business practices. I discreetly began to spread carefully worded inquiries, posing hypothetical scenarios about vendor disputes and the challenges of verbal agreements. I didn't name Julian, not yet, but I painted a picture so specific that anyone who had suffered at his hands would immediately recognize the culprit. The response was slow at first, then a trickle, then a small flood. Others had indeed been burned by Vance solutions. There were whispers of abandoned projects, inflated invoices, and the same infuriating reliance on misunderstandings and verbal agreements. None had pursued legal action, deterred by the cost, the ambiguity, and the fear of damaging their own corporate reputations. They had simply absorbed the losses and moved on, quietly nursing their resentment. This was precisely the environment I needed, a collective sense of injustice, unaddressed and simmering beneath the surface. My plan wasn't to initiate a class action lawsuit. That was too messy, too protracted, and still relied on proving verbal agreements in a court of law. My plan was to expose Julian Vance in a forum where his charm and fabricated narratives held no sway, where his history of deceit would be laid bare for all to see. I decided to target his most valuable asset, his reputation within the tech community, and more critically, his ability to secure new, lucrative contracts. The perfect opportunity arose with the annual Tech Innovators Summit, a prestigious industry conference held in Atlanta. Julian Vance was scheduled to be a keynote speaker, poised to deliver a presentation on disruptive innovation and agile client partnerships, a title so ironic it made my stomach churn. This was his stage, his moment to shine, to attract new clients and investors. It would also be his undoing. I worked tirelessly, compiling all the evidence, my own meticulously documented project records from Sterling Innovations, Sharon's detailed accounts and contractual documents from Apex Freight, and the corroborating, if anecdotal, evidence from my network. I cross-referenced everything, creating an irrefutable timeline of Julian's deception, highlighting the precise clauses he violated, the specific verbal promises he denied, and the exact financial damages incurred by each victim. It was a masterpiece of corporate forensics, cold, hard facts laid out with surgical precision. Then came the delicate part of the plan: how to present this information without appearing vindictive, without making it seem like a personal vendetta. I needed to appear as a concerned professional upholding industry standards. I drafted an anonymous, yet highly detailed report summarizing Vance Solutions' pattern of behavior backed by the documented evidence. I included excerpts from Julian's own boastful interview about Apex Freight, juxtaposed with Sharon's actual experience. The report focused on the dangers of ambiguous verbal agreements and the importance of stringent contractual adherence for corporate integrity. I chose my moment carefully. The Tech Innovators Summit. Not during his keynote, that would be too theatrical and easily dismissed as a stunt. Instead, I waited for the highly anticipated networking mixer on the second evening, an event attended by a who's who of venture capitalists, potential clients, and industry journalists. It was a crucible of reputation, where deals were often made on a handshake and reputations were quietly solidified or subtly undermined. I ensured copies of my anonymous report, professionally bound and discreetly labeled industry best practices, a case study in contractual integrity, found their way into the hands of key journalists, influential investors, and executives from companies known to be considering Vance Solutions for upcoming projects. I didn't personally hand them out. I utilized a small network of trusted contacts who, unbeknownst to them, were simply distributing what they believed was a valuable industry white paper. The report itself was carefully crafted to be factual, unemotional, and devastatingly precise, allowing the documented evidence to speak for itself. It didn't accuse Julian directly of fraud. It simply presented the irrefutable pattern of his business practices. It left the reader to draw their own damning conclusions. The buzz started almost immediately. Whispers turned into hushed conversations. Journalists began discreetly making calls. Executives were seen pulling out their phones, making urgent inquiries to their legal and procurement teams. The atmosphere, once jovial and networking-focused, became subtly charged with a sudden, unsettling current of suspicion. Julian Vance, still oblivious, was working the room, his usual charismatic self, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing around him. He smiled, he laughed, he shook hands, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath him was crumbling. The climax of my plan was orchestrated with surgical precision. Just as Julian was holding court with a group of potential investors, regaling them with tales of his company's unparalleled agility, one of the journalists I had targeted, a sharp, tenacious reporter known for her investigative pieces, subtly approached the group. She didn't shout or accuse. She simply held up a copy of my report, open to the section detailing the Apex Freight debacle, complete with a highlighted quote from Julian's old interview. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice calm but penetrating, "I'm curious about your definition of agile client partnerships. According to this report, it seems your definition often involves significant financial discrepancies and a rather flexible interpretation of signed contracts. Could you perhaps elaborate on your approach to verbal agreements versus written ones?" Julian's practiced smile faltered. His eyes flickered to the report, then to the journalist, then to the faces of the investors, which had suddenly hardened, their smiles replaced by wary, skeptical expressions. He stammered, attempting to deflect, to spin his usual narrative of misunderstandings. But this time, the facts were too stark, the documented pattern too undeniable. The journalist, armed with my meticulous research, pressed him calmly but relentlessly on specific points. The Apex freight contract versus his boasts, the Sterling Innovations project's cost overruns versus initial proposals. Other executives in the room, having quickly skimmed their own copies of the report, chimed in with their own pointed questions, their previous discomfort now turning into open distrust. The scene that unfolded was not a shouting match, but something far more devastating, a public intellectual dismantling of Julian Vance's carefully constructed facade. His usual charisma withered under the harsh glare of irrefutable evidence. The smooth talker was exposed as a slippery operator. His explanations became increasingly desperate, his body language revealing his growing panic. The investors who had moments ago been captivated by his pitch quietly excused themselves, their interest clearly evaporated. The following days saw the rapid unraveling of Vance Solutions. The journalist's story, fueled by my comprehensive report and interviews with other disillusioned clients, broke online within hours and was picked up by major industry publications. The article laid bare Vance Solutions' pattern of deceptive practices, citing multiple examples and highlighting the severe financial and reputational damage inflicted upon their clients. Sterling Innovations' legal team, now armed with this external validation of Julian's systematic deceit, found renewed vigor in our arbitration case. The arbitration panel, undoubtedly influenced by the public outcry and the irrefutable evidence of a pattern, quickly sided with Sterling Innovations, ordering Vance Solutions to pay substantial damages and to complete the project at their own expense, with severe penalties for further delays. It was a significant win and a public humiliation for Julian, but the real payoff was far more comprehensive. The public exposure triggered a cascade of consequences for Julian Vance. Existing clients began to terminate their contracts, citing loss of trust and reputational concerns. New business dried up completely. Venture capitalists, once eager to invest, withdrew their offers, their due diligence reports now plastered with warnings about Vance Solutions' unethical practices. Julian's carefully cultivated network of industry contacts, built on charm and false promises, evaporated overnight. His company, once a rising star, became a pariah, synonymous with deceit and unreliability. I watched from a distance, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. My role, the perceptive project manager, had allowed me to observe the fallout and then to engineer a justice that was meticulous, discerning, and utterly aligned with my principles. Julian Vance had built his career on ambiguous verbal promises, on chaos. I had built mine on precise agreements and ethical conduct. He had leveraged his cunning, I had leveraged my thoroughness. The corporate reputation I valued above all else, not just Sterling Innovations, but the broader industries, had been vindicated. The chaos he created had returned to consume him. The feeling wasn't one of wild jubilation, but a profound, quiet sense of order restored. The scales had been balanced. Julian Vance learned the hard way that some people like me believe deeply in accountability, that some battles, while fought with documents and facts, are ultimately about principle. The hum of the air conditioning in my office still sounds the same, but now it's a hum of peace, of a job meticulously done. If you appreciate a story where every detail matters and justice is served with surgical precision, then I urge you to subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. My story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective revenge is simply letting the truth, meticulously unearthed, speak for itself.